All right, well, welcome everybody to another installment of Joe and Josh Discuss. Today we are continuing our conversation through the book of Genesis. We're in Genesis chapter 41. Technically, we'll be discussing, I think, verses 37 to 57, but we'll start just a little bit earlier in the reading so that we can pick up a little bit of the context from our last discussion, which we didn't talk about too much. So welcome, Joe. Glad you're with me for another installment of this.
It's my pleasure, and we're glad to be able to talk about these things and reminisce through them and see if we can spark some interest in your minds. So let's enjoy our time together. I do. I hope you do too.
But we want to start conversations that you finish. Our hope is just to ignite your imagination and get you thinking about the intricacies of the text and the way that these historical events have been chronicled and narrated. And hopefully you'll come out with some better ideas than us. That would be the goal. Wouldn't that be a victory?
Oh yeah, stand on our shoulders, why don't you?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So here we are in Genesis 41. Joe's going to start us in verse 33. And I think we're reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Is that right?
That's what I have, yes.
All right.
Now therefore let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be reserved for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone else like this? One in whom the Spirit of God," that's a question mark, I didn't really read it that way. So the Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ordered themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried out in front of him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt."
All right. Well, that gives us a bit of an introduction. Now, we said this last time, Joe. I don't know if you agreed with me or not, but my impression is that Joseph wasn't angling for this job, but more revealing to Pharaoh from his experience and wisdom, or maybe from the Spirit of God himself, what a proper response to these dreams might be. And it seems to me it's Pharaoh's decision to put Joseph in charge. But what do you think about that? Do you think Joseph might have been angling for this position in the way he presented this to Pharaoh?
It, I think it would be a weak argument to argue that he was angling for it. The language doesn't seem to be set up that way. To me, it seems more like he's giving the information with the realization that nobody else could really give the answer. That might have been something that was like kind of epiphany to him as he was speaking it. But it doesn't appear that he was like trying to negotiate with him or trying to push his position. He doesn't even mention it. Would you agree? I mean, he doesn't say what he said to the cupbearer
Right. Yeah, I
in the
agree.
prison.
I tend to read this as Joseph was probably surprised. And I would think that the first readers of this history who didn't experience it would have thought it a strange thing that Pharaoh went this far. It's a similar thing that happens with Daniel later in Jewish history. Daniel gets also interprets a dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and he gets treated similarly. So I would think Joseph might be surprised by this turn of events that he ends up being the one in charge. It is a fulfillment of his dreams,
Mhm.
but it's still an unusual one. So but I guess you could read the story as Joseph kind of, you really should put someone in charge. I wonder if Pharaoh is suffering a little bit from something that still afflicts us today, and that is that if someone's good at one thing, they must be good at everything.
That's true.
Because here Joseph can interpret dreams, so why not put him in charge of the country? I wonder, is that a wise decision? Now, God's behind all of this. I
Hmm.
mean, obviously, God's the one who gave Joseph the dreams, and God has been with him, and God has been opening these doors. So I mean, God probably has a lot to do with this. But in just looking at it from an outsider, I'd say this is somewhat of a surprising and perhaps foolish decision on the part of Pharaoh. But maybe they revered people who could interpret dreams sort of the way we revere actors or athletes, that if you're good at that, then perhaps you should run the country or give us your opinion about unrelated things.
Yeah, they sometimes do that with actors and stuff in movies. They think because they played some smart fellow or they must be a genius, kind of thing. But one of the stories that come to my mind, I don't know why. Maybe it's out of the blue, but I know that it's sometimes in the scriptures there's reoccurring events that seem similar, and for some reason the story of Mordecai came to my mind of
Oh, yeah, in the
the
book of Esther.
situation. Yeah, and wondered, this grabbed a few similarities there with Mordecai, who had saved the king. He was Xerxes, was it, that was
The Bible calls him Xerxes.
yeah. So the idea that there was this kind of repayment for something, did I ever repay for this man?
Let me make a quick correction. I think
Okay.
we translate his name Xerxes now because I think that's the king that we believe him to be, but I think the Bible calls him Ahasuerus.
Oof,
But
that's a
anyway,
tough one to say.
yeah, I could be wrong about that, but that's what I'm recalling from memory. Anyway,
Yeah, so I was some reason that story was coming to my mind when I thought about what Pharaoh was doing for Joseph, and we feel like he's doing it for Joseph, but in reality, he's what he's suggesting is going to save Egypt.
right. Yeah, definitely a similarity. And in that case, the book of Esther, Mordecai's story, nobody remembers Mordecai's act, like you said, for a little while. And it's only on this night where Xerxes can't sleep and he's up pacing and he wants to read about the records of his reign that he finds out that Mordecai had done this. And then he decides to give him honor. Joseph was similarly forgotten for two
Mm-hmm.
years, right?
Yeah, close to close to extinction in some ways. Haman was building the gallows or sharpening the stick
Yeah.
for Mordecai.
Yeah, that is an interesting parallel. So I've already mentioned Daniel, and there certainly is some with Mordecai. And that reminds us, I think, of a theological truth, which is God tends to follow repeated patterns. It's one of the ways that we can test the spirits and know whether it's the Lord who's speaking to us. We talked about this a little bit with the dreams. God
Hmm.
is repetitive. He follows the same pattern so that we'll know it's him. I
Hmm.
think I've said this, maybe not in our discussions, but certainly in sermons and messages. There's nothing that causes more faith erosion than spontaneity.
Hmm.
Most of our confidence in things comes from regularity, comes from constancy.
Hmm.
I've said before, if gravity weren't constant,
Yeah.
there'd be a whole lot of things that we're able to do we wouldn't be able to do. Could you imagine flying an airplane if gravity fluctuated by 5%?
Hmm.
So the constancy of what we call nature leads to a lot of the stability and the ability of us to do the things we're able to do. And the
Hmm.
same is true, I think, biblically with God. The fact that he follows repeated patterns and that the stories we see in Genesis repeat over and over again throughout the scriptures is one of the ways that we can test the spirits and see whether it is indeed God acting or working. I
Hmm.
think that constancy is for our sake.
Hmm.
I think that's at the heart of what God means by chesed, often translated steadfast love. And the other Hebrew word is emet, which sometimes is translated truth, but means sort of firmness and steadfastness.
Hmm.
These are the things that God says he's full of. When he reveals himself to Moses, he says he's full of chesed and emet. And that
Mhm.
has to do with this stability and this constancy. And
Yeah.
so it's not surprising to find these patterns repeating over and over again. Like
Right.
I belabor that because some folks think it's just a feature of Hebrew writing, and the Hebrew writers are forcing these events into these repeated patterns because that's being imposed on the historical events by the prophetic tradition of Israel, the
Mhm.
authors, the editors, and all. But I think it's actually a feature of how God works.
Revealing his character and
Right.
his person. Yeah, I agree. And so I think we talked a little bit last time too about the organization and the issues that some people have with economics, with 1/5 of produce of the land being high taxation and abusive to some degree. And I think people can judge that kind of thing, but they weren't actually living in that time. So drastic matters require drastic things.
Yeah, and
I
we
would
wouldn't
say.
want to put the stamp of divine approval on everything that Pharaoh decides to do. Joseph tells him what his dreams mean and gives him some advice about how best to manage it, which is essentially you should save during those years of plenty, so that you have food in the years of famine, and you should put somebody over the process, right?
Mhm,
How Pharaoh decides to play that out, that's on him, right? And
mhm,
that, and so if from a modern or a contemporary perspective, we would critique what he did, that's fine. The fact
mhm,
that it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's right. I mean, there are plenty of sins recorded in the Bible. And what Pharaoh does isn't necessarily the right thing, nor is it necessarily what Joseph advised,
mhm,
what Pharaoh did. And
mhm,
even though Joseph's said to be in charge, a lot of this is rhetorical flourish. I mean, he's under Pharaoh. He's doing what Pharaoh says. He's like the chief servant in the land, but because he's Pharaoh's servant, the other Egyptians end up under him, not
mhm,
because there's anything great about Joseph, but because of who he works for.
mhm. Yeah, I think a lot of people think it's like they try to use this as like a justice story. God's man gets his moment of glory. I'm fearful that they missed the point with that.
Yeah, and we should probably say too, because it is Joseph's idea to reserve 1/5, like you
Mhm,
said, but that probably speaks more to the overabundance of food. Like Joseph is saying it's going to be so abundant that the people are going to flourish off of only 4/5.
mhm.
So it's not a tax. That
Yeah.
would be a real reading in to the text. He's not taxing the people, he's reserving
Mhm,
some of the bountiful harvest. And if they can live off 4/5, it's a bountiful harvest indeed.
yeah. So it's almost a prediction. Yeah, like if you image the cows were plump. If we were to use that word, they had
They
lots of.
were, as it said, sleek and fat. They were so
Yeah.
fat that their skin was stretched and shiny.
Hmm.
So they're quite plump.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was an abundance. I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of people, there's some. I feel like some people have tried to say that like Joseph was kind of fleecing them for what
Yeah.
they had.
And under normal circumstances, 20% taken from your produce would be. But this is to save the nation in an exceptionally bountiful year.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a tax.
Right.
Now, the
Yeah.
fact that Pharaoh then sells it to them later, that's his decision. I mean, Joseph does it because he's
Yeah.
working for Pharaoh, but that's clearly Pharaoh's decision.
Yeah.
That's different.
But it's definitely
That's that to me is a powerful, wealthy person taking advantage. In that case, I see Pharaoh a little bit like some of the villains in some of our American cinema who use desperate times as an opportunity to enrich themselves. And Pharaoh definitely does that. But that doesn't mean God approves of it, nor does it mean Joseph would have done it if he had the run of the land. He's doing what Pharaoh tells him to do.
yeah. And it's definitely not socialism. So where they're taking it from the rich and giving it to the poor. So
No, it's closer to feudalism.
yeah. Yeah.
right? It's closer. You've got a king who's going to own everything, and the people are just going to be like tenants on his land, leasing it. It's feudalism. It's not socialism.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And let's face it, a lot of Europe operated under that system for many centuries.
Long time. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And the Bible's not justifying it,
No, no, it's
nor
just
is
telling
it
the story.
condemning it. It's making no comment on it at all.
Right. Right.
So we can
Interesting.
condemn it. I
Go
don't
ahead.
I
I'm
don't
sorry.
want to live on a feudalistic society either.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we don't have a king, so at least not yet.
We have a king, but he's not the king of America.
But you and I have a
He's
king.
the king
But
of
speaking
kings.
as Americans, America
Yeah,
is not ruled by a king.
that's true. Very right. Very right.
Yeah. So in any case, as we get into kind of the more specific language of this, we had talked about this, you and I, before we started recording, but I think this is translated a little too orthodox in some ways. Not that I'm not orthodox, but I think we're making Pharaoh a little too orthodox in the way that it's translating his words to Joseph. To me, as I looked at the Hebrew, verse 38, Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone else like this?" The New Revised Standard Version says, "One in whom is the Spirit of God."
Mm-hmm.
I'm hesitant with that. The word God is plural, and sometimes in Hebrew that would still mean a singular being, as it often does when somebody from the Jewish tradition, from the Israelite people talk about God, they'll use Elohim in a singular way. And you can tell whether they're doing that based on the verbs. But
Mm-hmm.
here there's no verb that you can look at to know. And because it's Pharaoh speaking, I think this is more likely that he said, "One in whom is the spirit of the gods,"
Mm-hmm.
taking Elohim as plural as it is in its form. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this," and again, this is a plural God, and there are verbs here, but they're in a construct state in Hebrew, infinitive construct, so it doesn't have numbers. So you still don't know if it's singular or plural, but again, it's Pharaoh. So I think I would translate this to, "Since the gods have shown you
Mm-hmm.
all this." I would nuance the translation a little bit and not make Pharaoh appear to be a monotheist, which he's
Yeah,
clearly.
I get that, but I also would have to ask the question or be concerned about whether or not this kind of interpretation or is reflecting like it's been said before, like the Son of God or someone who has the Spirit of God is, the Son of God could be as this idea of reflecting a certain being, or it could also mean that they were under the influence, or the spirit is actually alive in them. So when he says the spirit of the gods or spirit of the gods, does that mean, do you think he's reflecting the idea of the power or the intellect or the ability to reflect the other gods? Or because these are the cows, these are in the dream, the elements were all things that in Egypt land they worshipped at one point in time.
Yeah, it's difficult to say for certain because we have three audiences in view. First, this is in the mouth of Pharaoh. So I'm hesitant to make him an Orthodox Hebrew theologian.
Yeah.
Since it's Pharaoh speaking here, I would guess historically he's speaking out of the context of his own religious faith, which is polytheistic. So that would be one context. And spirit of the gods might mean something unique for Egypt. Spirit means wind,
Mm-hmm.
breath. Ruach is the Hebrew. And so most likely what Pharaoh is saying is that whatever power, wind comes from the gods is blowing through Joseph. He's hearing the gods. So I would guess the second context is this is the book of Genesis. So what does spirit mean in the context of this book? And in this book, the spirit is the animating force that God puts into dead inert matter that makes it get up and live.
Mm-hmm.
So from a Hebrew perspective, which wouldn't be Pharaoh's perspective, but would be this perspective of those who would read it,
Mm-hmm.
Joseph is animated by God. That means the way Joseph is moving and acting here is
Hmm.
on behalf of God or through God. So in some ways, Joseph is being puppeted in a way,
Hmm.
meaning the words he speaks are God's words. That would be the sense of having the Spirit of God. Joseph is like a sail that's caught the wind of
Yeah.
God. So that
And
would be the Hebrew perspective. And then the third layer of this is you've got the overarching perspective of the First Testament in which this all takes place. And the Spirit of God does become closer to a person in what we now would call the Trinity in the First Testament, especially by the end, and becomes
mhm.
a full-fledged or fleshed out person of the Trinity in the New Testament. So is it saying that this member of the divine Trinity is at work here? I would say that's the least likely
Hmm.
thing in play in Genesis, especially in the mouth of Pharaoh.
Just to throw a curveball at you, verse 23 of 41, where it talks about the blighted east wind sprouting,
Yeah.
blighted by the east wind.
Yeah.
So is that, would that be in contrast to this idea of that's in 38, 41:23, where it says the 7 years withered thin and
Yeah.
blighted by the east wind,
Yeah.
sprouting
The
after them.
word ruach, spirit, breath, wind, is not there. That word is kadim, which means east wind or east.
Okay.
So wind is added for clarity, but it's not there in the Hebrew.
It's
So
not there.
ruach is
Okay.
not present there. Yeah.
So
Does that answer what you were asking?
yeah, sort of. I would wanted to see if there was a similarity or maybe a contrast between this idea of the east wind destroying the or blighting the those things,
Yeah.
and then the
Yeah, the
comparison of
Eastern
saying,
Desert, like I had said, I think in a previous one, the Eastern Desert is seen as a location of chaos and destructiveness and all of that. And so things from the East tended to be negative
mm-hmm,
in Egyptian thought. And probably part of that is that there's a desert there. But I think the biggest part of it is that most of Egypt's enemies came from that direction because
gotcha.
they're coming from the further east. So bad things generally come from the east in Egypt. So if you've got these nasty cows or nasty corn, you might say that they were afflicted by the east.
Mm,
But there's no, the word for wind is not there. So it's not a direct
okay.
correlative with the Spirit of God. So as we move on to verse 39 and we get past that, maybe you can say, since God has shown you all this. But I think it's since the gods have shown you all this,
Mm-hmm,
is my sense. There is no one so discerning and wise as you. So here are the words. So the word for discerning is the word being. And a form of it is also used for the preposition between.
hmm,
But so there are three words in Hebrew that kind of all interpenetrate. Being is one of them. The other is here, wise, discerning and wise. That's chokmah.
mm-hmm,
And the third is da'at, knowledge, the tree of knowledge, right?
mm-hmm,
Tree of da'at. So da'at is like just knowledge, just
mm-hmm.
information.
Facts, right?
Yeah, yeah. Wisdom, chokmah, is knowing when to apply or use knowledge in a certain given situation. So in Ecclesiastes, there's a time for everything under the sun, right? A time to mourn and a time to laugh, a time, to build up and a time to tear down. Wisdom is, or hakma, is knowing when the application of knowledge is appropriate.
Mm,
Discerning, being, is being able to tell between things. So it's understanding not just what or when to use the what, but something deeper about it, penetrating the knowledge and the wisdom to a more fundamental understanding. It's true discernment, telling the difference between right and wrong. So like with the tree of knowledge that we talked about in Genesis, the tree of Da'at, it's just facts, it's just knowledge. You'd need wisdom to know when to use it, but you'd need this binah or being to know which one was good and which one was bad. So if the tree had been a tree of binah or of being, then it would have been a tree of discernment. If it had been a tree of wisdom, it would have been a tree of hakmah. But it's just a tree of da'at. It's like a search engine today. Just gives you the information. It tells you nothing about it.
Mm.
So here, Pharaoh doesn't say that Joseph is full of knowledge. He gives him a much higher compliment.
Mm.
He's discerning and wise. He knows when to use the knowledge he has and why it should be used. He has a penetrating understanding of it. So,
I mean, it can't help but think of the dynamic between the king of Egypt and the guy who just come out of the prison, who was sold into slavery,
yeah,
by his brothers, and then the dynamic. I can't imagine. I can imagine all those people in the courts there, just like, what is going on here? You know.
And Joseph has demonstrated this not simply by interpreting the dreams, but also by the advice he gave.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more than just he's a dream interpreter. He also provides quite wise counsel as to how to respond to these dreams and how to prepare for the years of famine. So, it's a very short interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but Joseph has the interview's gone well for Joseph.
Yeah, but there's also a part of me that feels like this is almost, if you could read it in a sarcastic way.
You think Pharaoh means this insincerely?
No, I think he's quite glad that he has an answer, but I'm just saying there could I could see that some people might try to make this try to push it that way of, but
yeah, and if you're just reading along, you're not sure how to take this. Is this just flattery? Is it something else? But based on what Pharaoh does right after this, it seems sincere.
Yeah, or stupid.
Yeah. Again, is it wise to put somebody in charge? Now, of course, Joseph has a little history in Egypt, so you wonder, did Pharaoh consult Potiphar? Did he consult the jailer to find out who this Joseph was, or is he just really impressed with his interpretation of the dream and his advice? But we know it all comes together to show that God is with Joseph in almost everything he does, and somehow Pharaoh discerns that. And so he puts him over Pharaoh's house, which is Egypt, right? Pharaoh is the head of Egypt. And his people shall order themselves as you command. Now, he's not abdicating any authority to Joseph. In some ways, this is rhetorical flourish. He's putting Joseph as his chief servant. Joseph is becoming to Pharaoh what he had been to the jailer and what he had been to Potiphar. So Joseph is in charge, but only because he's serving Pharaoh. Pharaoh is still in charge. He's not abdicating anything to Joseph. But he is putting Joseph as his chief servant in this regard, which means Joseph's word is Pharaoh's word. Yeah. And I don't know much about the rituals here. I don't know if you did any research on the rituals. I'm assuming that this would have been normal, and we certainly see it throughout the Bible, the signet rings and the change of clothes and the jewelry and then riding in a chariot. There's a lot of features here that we see again in Esther, as you said.
Yeah. Bow the knee, kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's unclear. Is this historical? Is this what Egyptians would have done? Was it what Persians would have done? That seems important to us, but what the Hebrew prophets are trying to do is describe to Hebrew people the honor being bestowed on them. And they might have used Hebrew ways of doing that to make it clear. So I don't know how historically accurate this is, if this is what would normally have been done, but obviously it's throughout the First Testament, so it's likely to be a practice throughout the the ancient Near East.
Hmm. Well, there are some specifics in there, like you said, fine linen, the signet ring, second in command chariot.
Certainly, chariots are a feature in Egypt that are not. I don't think the Israelites often don't use chariots because a lot of their country is too hilly for it. It tends to be something used in the plains of the Promised Land,
Mhm,
like where the Philistines were. And it certainly was a feature of Egyptian warfare. So that's
mhm,
very contextual.
mhm.
So this is a lot of formalities, but essentially Joseph is being placed in charge under Pharaoh's leadership of this endeavor.
Yeah. Do you have anything to say about the no one consent to lift one hand or foot in all of Egypt
Yeah, I
uh,
think
without
this
your
is
consent?
the rhetorical flourish I was talking about. Essentially, no one can lift hand or foot without Pharaoh say so, and
Mhm,
Pharaoh is putting Joseph in charge of this, so his authority translates to Joseph in this particular endeavor.
mhm.
But he's really talking about his own authority.
Yeah, yeah,
Joseph, it's a derivative authority for Joseph.
yeah. I definitely can see that. He goes even further though in 45. We haven't read that yet, and I'll let you do that if you like.
Yeah, I'll read this. So Pharaoh gave Joseph, yeah, he gave me the hard names. But Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanat Paneah, and he gave him Asenat, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, as his wife. Thus Joseph gained authority over the land of Egypt.
Mhm,
So it's phrased that way, I think, to correlate with Joseph's dreams.
mhm.
So the sun, moon, and stars that he saw bowing down to him, if you recall, in his second dream, and his Pharaoh took that as his, I mean, Jacob took that as himself and his mother bowing down to him. This is fulfilled much more specifically in Egypt, since the correlation of the stars and the moon and the sun to Egyptian gods and goddesses and to the royal family of Egypt, they're all bound together.
Hmm.
So Joseph's dream, now in hindsight, clearly he was going to Egypt, but at the beginning you could never have told what that dream meant until it happened,
Right.
unless God gave him the authority. So he gains authority over the land of Egypt, but as we said, as a surrogate for Pharaoh, he's not taking Pharaoh's authority. He's merely exercising it.
And in some ways, giving him a wife and a daughter of the priest of On, he's trying to assimilate. Would you agree him into Pharaoh's
Yeah,
or
make him
to Egyptian?
acceptable perhaps to
Yeah.
Egyptian society. Yeah. And we talked about this personally, some research that you did on Asenat and some later traditions that try to make her a daughter of Jacob's daughter Dinah
Yeah.
and not an Egyptian.
Right. Which is, in my opinion, stretching.
Yeah,
But
that tradition is centuries and centuries and centuries later, and most likely born out of a concern that Joseph would have married an Egyptian woman and trying to, but there's no evidence in the scriptural text at all that this woman Asenat was anything other than an Egyptian woman, daughter of Potipharah.
yeah, and there's some interesting other side commentaries too that tried to say that she was already engaged with another guy, and that
Yeah,
she didn't even like Joseph, and Joseph didn't like her, and sounds like that Hollywood drama type of stuff. And then people have tried to make similarities about because you know Potipharah was a priest of On, that there was some type of religious conversion of Joseph's wife to
right.
in order to make them true Hebrews, or make her, to be, obviously because of their kids, is I think that what the connection is trying to protect.
Yeah, and Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, become significant tribes in Israel, and many of the kings rule from the tribal territory of Ephraim and Manasseh for the northern kingdom. So the fact that they are Egyptian, part Egyptian, and all that might have caused later generations some consternation, but it's much, much later, post First Testament.
Yeah, well, certainly not in the same connection as the Samaritans.
Yeah.
That type of situation, I don't think they can make the argument that Joseph was intentionally trying to dilute the lineage of Jacob.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Asenat's daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, I guess is how it should be pronounced, it's a long O. And that is a city in Egypt celebrated for worship of the sun god Ra.
Mm-hmm.
But On is not a deity, that's a city.
The city, okay.
The different gods of Egypt can be associated with different cities and during different time periods. But On is known for worship of the sun god Ra. And it's
Mm-hmm.
also called in Jeremiah the Sun City.
Okay.
So that's where she's a priestess of. And who knows, there might have been a reason that Pharaoh did that, because Ra is, or Amun Ra, depending on the time period, is sometimes the chief of the gods. And he may associate, when Joseph is speaking as though there's only one God, Pharaoh may interpret that as Ra and may have given him a wife from that city for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Give him some props, should we say?
Yeah, or maybe this would be an easier way for Joseph to enculturate into Egyptian society, since he clearly worships a God he thinks is almighty, will get him into the family of someone who serves the almighty God in our pantheon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, syncretism, they call it, right? In modern academics, when you take features of one religion and try to import them into another religion under different names and try to accommodate one belief system into the belief system of another.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens throughout the First Testament. And there's even an Egyptian pharaoh many centuries later that creates a type of monotheism in Egypt and makes Ra the god.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be
Interesting.
related. Yeah, so
Yeah.
interesting. Anyway, Joseph's 30.
Yeah, it's almost like they want to put a stake in the ground, tell you how old he is right now.
Yeah, it's an important repetitive thing, because in Jewish tradition, right up to the time of Jesus, to be an elder, one must reach at least 30 years old. It's one of the reasons why in the New Testament Gospels, Gospel of Luke, for instance, comes right out and tells us Jesus' age, that he's around 30. History tells us Jesus was probably 34
Mm-hmm.
when he started his earthly ministry, but he's around 30. And that again is significant, because Jesus himself waits to lead
Mm-hmm.
and to go out into public ministry until he reaches the age of eldership in Israel. And it's pointed out here in Joseph as well. And these won't be the only two examples. Joseph's old enough for this position.
Yeah.
God waited to give it to him until he was old enough. And that comes into the New Testament when the Apostle Paul says that you shouldn't make someone an elder in one of the churches who's a recent convert.
Mm-hmm.
But it also comes into Timothy, who has apparently been placed in eldership in the city of Ephesus, maybe a bit younger than 30.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul tells him not to let folks look down on him because of his youth.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is a recurring feature throughout our scriptures. Joseph is 30. He's old enough. God waited till he was old enough. We didn't know that maybe God was waiting for a certain age, that all that suffering was for the purpose of maturation. But I think that's what's assumed here.
Mm-hmm. Well, that means he was 28 in prison. He had to wait 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah.
It's always significant when we're given ages, and they come sparsely in the Bible. We pay attention when they are here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It says something about the expectation of a lifespan too, though. When you compare 30 to Methuselah,
Yeah.
there's quite a big.
Yeah. For the uninitiated, Methuselah lived to 969 years old.
Yeah. So 30 years is a drop in the bucket, right?
Those who love to do the math, right? Methuselah dies in the year of the flood.
Mm.
If you do the math. Yeah. Interesting. So
Yes,
Joseph's 30 when he enters the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he goes out from Pharaoh's presence, goes through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plenteous years, the earth produced abundantly. Now, we're not sure when those 7 years began. Do you think the implication is that they began immediately?
Well, I think so. There's no reason. Is there a good reason to believe that it didn't?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just interesting that there's no real time discussion. I would imagine it would have taken some time to set up the infrastructure for storing all of this.
Yeah,
So
to
I would have
build.
expected at least a little delay, but we're not told.
Yeah.
But Joseph does. He stores up all the food of the 7 years of plenty in the land of Egypt. And he stored grain in such abundance. We remember this is just a fifth
Hmm.
of everything that was produced, that he couldn't even count it. He had to
Right.
stop measuring. It was beyond measure.
Like the sand
And
of the
that's
sea.
just 20% of it.
Right.
You imagine just how much there was.
Right. How to process all that. I mean, we're so detached from it. I mean, we think of flour, we think of
Yeah.
seed, we think of food, and how to store that much food without it going bad
Yeah,
or
they must
getting
have been
moist.
building storehouses like crazy.
Yeah.
So one thing that sometimes comes up, I'm wondering what you think about this, Joe.
Hmm.
So Jesus tells a parable in the New Testament about a farmer who has a bumper crop. He
Hmm.
has his crops are much larger than he anticipates. And so he decides to build larger barns to store this excess food. And in Jesus' parable, God then requires his life of him so that he can't benefit from what he has stored up.
Hmm.
And most people, and I think this is a pretty natural reading of the parable in the New Testament, assume that God is critiquing the hoarding of resources.
Hmm.
So I've sometimes mentioned that to folks. And when I do, they'll always bring me back to Joseph and the storing during the 7 years of plenty for 7 years of famine. And they'll almost always associate the hoarding of resources with this story, that we're storing up for a rainy day, that I'm
Hmm.
saving now for a need later. So, have you ever thought about how you juxtapose those two teachings and how you might bring Jesus' teachings into dialogue with the events of this historical epic?
Yeah, I guess the way I've looked at that parable, I felt like it was what I recall about it is that the phrase that he said was we have to tear down my old barns and build new ones for the surplus. And I always felt like there was something wrong with that idea that there was that the waste wasn't really in the effort of storing all this food, and you can't really compare that with Joseph. I'll get to that in another point, but the idea that he was going to destroy something that he already had. It didn't. They called them old barns, but is that are we talking about the same parable? Um,
Yeah,
you
it's in
know,
Luke 12. For anyone who might want to look it up, it's in Luke 12, starting in verse 15.
so I think the idea that when we have things like that, it's got nothing to do with. It's not the same comparison because Joseph is storing up food because they're planning to be able to supply food for people. It doesn't the parable doesn't seem to finish that way. It seems like it's more like the focus is more on the fact that his energy is not in to provide for people, but because he's got such quantity, he has to make a bigger barn, tear
Right.
down what his old stuff. Maybe it's like the wineskins kind of mentality, where the truth of what you're learning through this experience is it doesn't fit into the model that you're trying to make. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's confusing or not, but
Well,
I
it's a
definitely
confusing
I don't see the
topic.
comparison with Joseph at all.
Yeah, I mean, they're both cases of storing. I sometimes, as I've thought about it, I think that Pharaoh himself uses this as an opportunity to become like the man in Jesus' parable, in that he uses this as an opportunity to enrich himself. And he sells the grain back to his people and eventually comes to own all the land of Egypt and even the people who have to sell themselves to him, their animals, everything. And
Mhm.
so I do think he becomes that rich man in a way. But the difference, I think, is that the person in Jesus' parable, he doesn't know that lean times are coming. He doesn't know if he has 30 years left of life or two. He
Mhm.
is saving just in case.
Mhm.
Right? There's no certainty about his future, but he's saving just in case. And he's using that as a way of giving himself peace and respite, saying, hey, if I live another 30 years, now I know I've got enough. And the point of Jesus' parable is you don't know what the future holds. And so hoarding your resources now and refusing to help others with them on the speculation that you might need them is different. That's not the Joseph story. In the
Yeah.
Joseph story, Pharaoh was given two dreams, and Joseph specifically says why he was given the dream twice, because it's fixed and God is absolutely going to do it. So it's not that there might be 7 years of famine that we're saving for just in case. There
Yeah.
will be 7 years of famine, which God is going to send extra now so that you won't die then. These are certainties. They're
Mhm.
not speculation. They're not just in case. So Pharaoh and Joseph are making decisions based on the revelation of God about future certainties.
Mhm.
Man in Jesus' parable is reserving money just in case and putting his faith and trust in that reserve for his future happiness.
Mhm.
Seems to me very different circumstances, but there is a correlation in both cases. Somebody is saving for today for tomorrow.
Mhm.
That's the same, but very different reasons.
Yeah, and then there's also the idea that the the parable doesn't reflect the dispersion of the or why, why. I mean, because Jesus says, "You fool, your today your life has been
That's right.
required."
Yeah. In the parable, the guy was building these barns and he was going to die that night.
Right.
So it ended up being a waste to store
Hmm.
that all up because he wasn't going to enjoy it. Of course, he didn't
Hmm.
know that. So
Hmm.
when you don't know what the future holds, what's the best way to live now? And Jesus, I think, is suggesting in that parable that saving up all your good for later is not a good thing to do because you don't know what the future holds. Maybe
Yeah.
he was storing up all that stuff and he thought, I'll be able to help people for the next 5 years. But he didn't have 5 years and he didn't know
Hmm.
that. So, kind of postponing the good you could do today until tomorrow is foolish when you have no certainty of the future. But that's a very different context than what's happening in the Joseph story. Again, they're operating in certainties. God has told them in certain terms what the future holds, and they are intended to respond to that revelation. The man
Yeah.
building the bigger barns has no such communication from God.
Yeah. And there's a structure that they've kind of set in place, and it's just a matter of fact. It doesn't. There's no negotiation. People haven't talked, saying, "Hey, this is fair. This isn't fair." We don't know. Want to know any of that stuff. I think it's because it's intended to show us that in the end, people survive because of it.
Yeah.
But you know,
Yeah. So, I mean, similar but different. And,
yeah.
when we get into the question of whether we should be storing up, it's interesting to read the history of Christian teaching. So I did this series about a year ago, revisiting the sermons of John Wesley, the Anglican priest,
Mhm.
John Wesley, who was a founder of Methodism, one of the founders anyway. And so, as I was preaching through his messages, I came across this interesting way of reading the Gospels of Jesus that I had never thought about before. Apparently, at least in most circumstances, Wesley took everything Jesus said as a command.
Mm.
And one of the things Jesus says is, don't store up treasures on earth.
Mm.
And in the sermon I was looking at, Wesley took that so literally that he actually believed it to be a sin to have anything in his bank account at the end of the year. He believed it should be completely cleared. And so it's interesting, he took that very seriously. Of course, most Christians I know take it metaphorically, but he took it as like a straight out command. So it is a complicated conversation to have. Like, to what extent should we hoard our current resources for our future? That's a deep conversation, and I'm not sure the story of Joseph really figures much into it.
Yeah, I as usual, I think people often think they can use the First Testament as a ramrod for certain things, and that doesn't do justice to the text or the circumstances. You have to be very careful.
There's always a context, and so we should understand the full story of what's happening with Joseph before we try to apply it to our lives. I'm not saying it doesn't have application.
Yeah.
Like, if the Lord were to reveal to us, as he did to the apostles in the book of Acts, that a famine was coming, he reveals that through a prophet in the book of Acts. God does, in the context of the early church. And they take that seriously, and they begin storing up because they believe they've been warned. But that is in response, just like in the Joseph story, to a revelation of God. It's not just in case, it's to an actual imminent threat. And so I'm not saying that God won't do what he did in the days of Joseph and what he did in the days of the early church, that he might give us a warning and we would have to act in response to that. But the question of whether we should save our resources for the future when we don't have a revelation of God, just on speculation, that's a different conversation, and one probably well past due. The church should have it again. Our ancestors had it. Like Wesley's an example of that. Yeah, it might be worth having, but the Joseph story is different.
Right. Yeah. Are you? I know it's kind of not a big thing because I don't think there's any answer for it. But Joseph's Egyptian name. Do you have any thoughts or anything that I don't know what it means, and I don't think
Yeah, I
that I
don't either.
found any. I
Let me
don't
see
think I
what it
know what it
means. It means the God speaks and he lives.
means. Okay. Who's going to
Yeah.
argue with that one, right?
Yeah, so obviously it's a name based on Pharaoh's experience with Joseph.
There you go.
He's labeling him as one who hears the voice of God, I guess.
Yeah. All verbs, huh?
Yeah, it's two words. I would have to break them all down. It says it's an Egyptian saying, but Zaphnat Paneach is how it is in Hebrew. But the God speaks and he lives is what the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew and English lexicon, that's how it translates it.
Yeah.
It is
Well,
interesting, though, that the word Zaphnat also tends towards the Hebrew word for hissing, like
oh
with
yeah.
snakes. Anyway,
Yeah, that's bizarre.
yeah, probably a slightly different root, but it does look strangely similar to that. So anyway, I don't have much more than that. In Hebrew itself, if it wasn't Egyptian, that the word that this is built off of, the verb zaphan, means to hide or to treasure up, something like that. But it's an Egyptian saying again. So Joseph is 30. He's gathered up all this food. It's so much he can't even count it.
Yeah.
And then we're told this little detail in verse 50 that before the years of famine came, so this is during the years of plenty,
Yeah.
Joseph has two sons. The firstborn, Manasseh, the second, Ephraim.
Yeah.
And they both names have to do with God's grace.
Both Hebrew names, aren't they?
Both Hebrew names, Manasseh relating to forgetfulness and Ephraim to fruitfulness. Yeah. And again, Hebrew names are never exactly the words they come from. They just sound like.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But then the 7 years end,
Yeah.
and the famine begins. And
So
it's
what?
not just in Egypt.
Why do you think it's important that he has his kids before it? Is it because it makes a statement about his person?
For me, it's because it's the years of plenty.
Yeah.
Children are born during the years of plenty. They're blessings, and that's how Joseph receives them.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it's interesting, because Ephraim means for God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortunes.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
I don't know, man. They've had 7 years of good stuff, and you got a wife, and you got two sons. That's pretty good. The statements really
Set
really
a
help.
table, this to use the words of David many years later, one of Joseph's, well, no, one of Judah's descendants. He set a table before me in the presence of mine enemies.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Joseph was living that out.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, it's just the idea that God has made me forget all of my hardships in all my father's house. That's interesting. He's certainly not talking about Pharaoh's house. He's talking about Jacob's house,
Right.
and the fact that his mom died and all that stuff. It must have been difficult.
Yeah. Joseph, Jacob had two wives and two concubines, all of whom were prolifically fruitful, except for Joseph's mother, who only had the two children. So this is a blessing for Joseph, but not an overabundant one. He only does have two, right? Which in his family is small potatoes,
Yeah,
but
but it
two's
does,
enough for
but it does reflect his experience with his mom.
it does.
Almost
Yeah.
like he's maybe duplicating at least or replacing what was lost.
Yeah, it's
It's
hard
like,
to say, but
uh,
he receives their births as blessings.
yeah.
So this is a quite extreme famine because it afflicts all the countries surrounding Egypt, the entire ancient Near East. But Egypt, there's food, and it seems to be, I mean, do you read it this way? It almost sounds like only Egypt was prepared.
Yeah. Or didn't or was only the one that was really prepared. It might have been some that they did something, but not
Yeah,
wasn't
and
enough.
we're only ever told the stories we're told. So we can't say that God didn't give dreams to the other leaders in the ancient Near East. But the real uniqueness is that Joseph was in Egypt. So even
Mm,
if all of those leaders had had similar dreams and God had tried to communicate with them without Joseph to interpret those dreams, they would have come and gone, because in the case of Pharaoh, no one could interpret them for him. And if Joseph hadn't been there, he wouldn't have known what they meant. So I
mhm.
think it's only speculation to say how God would have interacted with the others. But what we do know for certain is that
Excuse me.
Joseph's presence in Egypt was unique,
Hmm.
and Egypt uniquely prepared.
Right, right. And it,
And
it
Pharaoh
reveals.
keeps Joseph close, which tells you that there is a need for this kind of relationship with God,
Hmm.
but it's rare. We find the same thing among Nebuchadnezzar, among the Babylonians, in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When Nebuchadnezzar becomes aware of someone who has these insights, he keeps them close. They're rare,
Hmm.
but necessary.
Hmm. Yeah, the last verse there says more all over the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain
Yeah.
because the
And,
famine, yeah, all
this
over the
is a
place.
bit of hyperbole, at least the near world. We're not going to try and claim the famine extended all the way to Spain and China or whatever, but we're certainly the whole world known to them, which was the region of the ancient Near East and northern Africa,
Hmm.
and probably some of the nations around the Mediterranean. It was a quite widespread famine.
Right. Is there any other writings that you're aware of that might reflect this?
No, I haven't done too much research to see if there's any record of a famine round about this time, which, the dating, when scholars try to date the events of the First Testament, there's a lot of disputing. So
Hmm.
critical scholarship says that the Exodus occurred in 1290, and this would have been 400 years before that. So we'd be looking, in the 16 to 1700s BC to find a famine. But the Bible says that the Exodus occurred in 1446. So be looking closer to 1900.
Hmm.
See, and I don't know if anyone's ever done that research. That's certainly something our folks could look up.
Yeah, it'd be
Yeah,
fun.
was there a widespread famine? One thing I can say is that famines are very common in this part of the world, so it wouldn't be surprising.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough terrain. I mean, it's not like Kansas. Or
And we don't know what the source of the famine was, because in this part of the world, you can get a famine for lack of rain,
Mhm,
but you can also get a famine from too much. So
mhm,
we're also not certain. Maybe we'll find out later, but at least at this point, we're not sure if the famine is because of floods
mhm,
or if it's because of a lack of rain or for
mhm.
some other reason like locusts or something like that. Like we don't really know what's caused the famine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. That's other than the idea of the east wind.
The scorching east wind, yeah, which is
Yeah,
just another way of saying bad stuff.
yeah, bad stuff. Bad wind.
Yeah, that was
Bad
definitely
wind.
a bad wind.
Yeah.
But they translated the whole world came to Joseph. Of course, that's not the word. In Hebrew, it's eretz.
Mm-hmm.
All the land came to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
word world, usually translated world, I would expect to see the word olam, and that's not here. But it's the word eretz, which means land, earth, or region.
Region. Yeah. Little less global.
Yeah, I don't think that the writers of Genesis intended it to be global.
Yeah.
This is a very widespread regional famine
Mm-hmm.
that affects all the countries surrounding Egypt, and they have to come here to buy food. And it's
Right.
clearly affecting the land of Canaan because Joseph, as we'll find out soon, Joseph's family is involved.
Right.
They're impacted.
And probably it's it's leading to the conclusion that that's what the most important part of it is, not of telling the story, right? That they're
Well,
coming, that they're
not to
affected by
say
it.
not to say that the Egyptians and the other nations are unimportant to God. He clearly
Hmm.
spared them all. But the
Hmm.
reason we have been told this story and it's been preserved is because it did affect Israel.
Hmm.
That doesn't make them more important, though, for narrative purposes, they are the chosen people that are revealing God to us. So we have to know their story.
Right. Right.
But of course, God saves all of these surrounding nations by this act, not just Israel.
Right. And therefore the abundance had to be as much as the like the sands of the sea.
Right?
I
Yeah.
mean,
It's
that's not just the edge, that's the what's in the water too, right?
there's something, as we kind of wrap up, because we're not going to go further than this in this conversation. As we wrap it up, I do, sometimes you think, well, I shouldn't say you, sometimes I think that God would want everybody to come to Israel for help because in that way, everybody could get a little message from the true faithful people of God, right? Oftentimes in our own culture, Christians do service and they give out food and they do all that because they want an opportunity to share the gospel. And we want to bring people to us,
Hmm.
which is why we start these things rather than just joining with the state in a soup kitchen where we wouldn't get to control the messaging. We want to run it out of our church so that we can give them a message with the food. And you'd think that would be ideal. It's interesting here that God does not bless Jacob and his family and that then get the whole world to come to them,
Hmm.
but he blesses a foreign power, Egypt. And
Hmm.
even the holy chosen people have to go there to get help. It's an interesting, unexpected turn.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
why does it happen? It does just happen because they sold Joseph into slavery. Like if Joseph had stayed with them, would it have been a different story? I guess we can only speculate.
Yeah. But I see a lot of similarities too with that, like the sand of the sea from what was told to Abraham.
Yeah.
And so if you begin to think about the effects of those, I mean, Joseph was in Potiphar's house, then in prison,
Yeah.
In each one of those places, it's describing what you just said about being in an odd place in a difficult situation, and
Right.
yet God still used you through that circumstance.
Right.
So it's this idea of the like being sand in the sea. You go to the beach, it's usually it's in your pockets and everywhere else.
Yeah.
The influence.
Well, do you have any closing thoughts, Joe, as we conclude this section of Joseph's story?
Yeah, I would just really remind us that the story isn't like the comeback kid kind of mentality. It's God doing something that needs to happen, and I think often we get overwhelmed by our circumstances, whether it be sicknesses or COVID, but to realize that God is actually doing something, and we may not understand all of it, all of what's going on, but we need to be asking God, what do you want me to do in response to this? Because Joseph could have just you know said, I give up. I can't win. I'm always the underdog. I'm always the one getting cast into the dungeon or into the cistern, or and people get down like that. But to realize that God has a purpose, and he's doing things through history that to reveal himself and what he wants to do in us and through us. And I would just encourage you to read the text, and not just listen to it, but ask God, how am I to respond to this? What am I supposed to do in reflecting on this? And it's more than a story, is what I'm trying to say. It's not like the
Yeah.
Princess
Yeah, and
Bride.
I agree with you. It's not a parable about someone working hard and succeeding. You're right. Joseph only succeeds because God is working in him and around him and through him. There's nothing that is accomplished in the story that Joseph could have accomplished on his own. And yet, Joseph is a hard and faithful worker.
Mhm.
We shouldn't be discouraged. There are lots of hard and faithful workers who never get noticed,
Mhm.
whose work never produces the fruits we hope that it will. We remain in obscurity and overlooked by our managers or our bosses, and our qualities never truly seen. So the fact that Joseph is a hard worker is great, but that's not the reason he succeeded. Of
Mhm.
course, if he hadn't been a hard worker and a faithful and diligent worker, maybe he wouldn't have succeeded. But the story is insistent that the reason Joseph gets noticed is because of God.
Mhm.
So it's not a story about, like you said, the old American tale of people pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps and making something of their lives. Joseph doesn't become leader of Egypt because he's crafty and wise and takes advantage of his opportunities and works harder than everybody. That's not the story. But he is a diligent worker.
Mhm.
But he also does it right, which sabotages him at times.
Mhm.
Right? I mean, his refusal to have the affair with Potiphar's wife ended him up in prison. So Joseph is not trying to get to the top of anything. He's trying to do it right.
Mhm.
The only reason he rises to the top is because that's what God intended.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's a complicated story, but it's good to remind us of what it's not.
True. True. Yeah.
Yeah. But again, God's sovereignty and human responsibility is working together in this tale.
Mhm.
Joseph is not a slacker. He's not lazy. He's not inefficient. And God suddenly works around all that and makes him successful. Joseph is a hard worker.
Mhm.
But again, he could never have accomplished what he did simply by his own effort. The
Yeah.
two are working together.
Yeah.
And I think we could all admit, right, Joe, that it's easier to keep working hard if things work.
Mhm.
Like if your efforts are recognized
Mhm.
and applauded. And so probably the fact that Joseph gets noticed increased his efficiency.
Mhm.
So God is probably even at work in Joseph's continuing motivation to be a diligent and hard worker because he
Mhm.
does get noticed. It's hard, isn't it? Do you agree? It's hard to keep your nose to the grindstone when nobody notices and nothing works.
Yeah.
It's really hard. Joseph did not have to experience that.
Hmm.
But I would say if you are someone working really hard and not getting noticed, Joseph did have long periods like that when he was
Hmm.
in prison. And don't be discouraged. Keep doing what's right. Don't
Right.
become, to quote the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, don't become weary in doing what is right,
Hmm.
for you will receive your reward in God's time.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And Joseph is a rarity. Maybe this is my final word. Not everyone who follows God faithfully ends up with a life Joseph received.
Yeah.
Plenty end up in obscurity, plenty suffer, plenty live their lives by trial, constantly under threat. I think of prophets like Jeremiah or Elijah who never really received their reward in this world.
Hmm.
Joseph is a rarity. So we shouldn't feel like failures if we don't
Yeah.
get Joseph's happy ending.
Yeah. Well, certainly don't use it for a formula to think you're going to get that ending. I mean, obviously the apostles, they're all martyrs. So
Jesus
it,
himself.
yeah. So
Yeah. Yeah. So we don't want to take Joseph's story as a template for the ideal Christian life or nor do we want to tell people who are suffering that don't worry, one day you'll be in charge of all of Egypt because Joseph was in prison and eventually that's not the promise made to us.
right.
Joseph ascends to that level because God chose him to exercise a task that God wanted done that required that level of authority. But that is by God's choice and grace, not by Joseph's efforts.
Right. Right. Good stuff.
Well, thank you, Joe.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all for listening. Any final words for our folks?
Well, go in peace and keep reading. Go ahead. We're going to be in the 42, I think, next time, though.
Yep, 42 verse 1. We'll
Verse 1.
finally get back to Joseph's family who sold him to slavery.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. Yeah. Excellent.
All right, well, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time. If you want to read ahead, we'll be in Genesis chapter 42.
Yes. Let's read it. Let's be together on it.